name is Manuel Eisner. I'm from the University of Cambridge, and I'm interviewing Michael Tonry from the University of Minnesota. And I would like to start with asking you about what brought you into criminology.
Random chance. I never took a criminology course, or a research methods course, or a statistics course, or a criminal justice course, but I was working as a commercial lawyer in Chicago, utterly hated it, was looking desperately for a job doing something else, and a friend said, "Oh, Michael, a friend of mine just gave up a job at the University of Chicago Law School to go to New York. Why don't you call a man called Norval Morris and ask him if he'd like to hire you?" So I called Norval Morris, who was a well-known criminal law professor, later the dean of the University of Chicago Law School, and a moderately well-known criminologist, and he hired me to be the deputy director of his Center for Studies in Criminal Justice.
Okay.
So it was random chance. If he had been an environmentalist or a labor lawyer, that's what I would be doing. So I have no lifetime mission to be a criminologist.
So what did you do, how did your career continue after you'd been working with, in Chicago?
I was only there for a little under 2 years. At a time I did not much like living in the US. I was desperate to find a job somewhere else. So I started looking in the classified ads of the London Times newspaper, where all law faculty jobs had to be advertised. And I wrote a form letter, and every time there was a new ad, I would write a letter saying, "Dear Professor so-and-so," and I got hired, amazingly, at the University of Birmingham. And so I went off to England to be a lecturer at a very, very low salary, and I did that for several years. And met a lot of British young academics of my age cohort, which is part of why I spent a good bit of the rest of my career in England, and had many contacts with English academics, because I knew them when we were all children.
And so, but afterwards you went back to the United States.
Gets too complicated, yes, I went back. For family reasons, I had to go back. Practiced law, taught at the University of Maryland. Moved to the backwoods of Maine to be a small-town lawyer. I bought a newspaper and edited a newspaper for a while. I set up a publishing company. I had a nonprofit research firm. We designed some very big criminology projects, something called the Program on Human Behavior in Chicago Neighborhoods, which made Rob Sampson famous, was actually one of our projects that Lloyd Olin and I directed from Castine, Maine. And then eventually I went back into a law school in the early 1990s.
Can you tell me something about the series of Crime and Justice, which has become such a benchmark publication?
Very, very kind of you to phrase the question that way. Crime and Justice is a book series published by the University of Chicago Press. It's technically a hardcover journal. Comes out once or twice a year. Its quick history is that there was an organization called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, created in the federal government in the 1970s. After the race riots of the 1960s and some other things, to be a stimulator of criminal justice policy development and research. It had a research institute called the National Institute of Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice. And altogether they had $5 billion, which would probably be $25 billion now, 90% of which was wasted. When LEAA, the parent organization, was shut down, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, the National Academy of Sciences did a review of the work of the National Institute of Justice and said, some of the work the National Institute of Justice had sponsored was actually pretty good, even if much of it was terrible. But nobody knew about it because it was inaccessible. So the National Academy of Sciences proposed that the federal government establish a review of research and a review of evaluation. They were prototypes. Well, the Crime and Justice was the review of research. They approached Norval Morris in 1976 to ask if he would do it. He said, I couldn't possibly do that. I can't edit anything, but I have this young lad working with me who will do it with me, and so we did it together. The evaluation one was produced once and died. We're now on volume 46, so we've been going for 40 years.
You came back to Europe for a longer period of time when I also came a few years before I came to Cambridge. And I wondered whether you could tell me something about how this felt as a difference to working in the United States.
Oh, okay. Well, let me say as a start, I did teach in England in the 70s at Birmingham University, and I spent a year in Oxford in the early 1990s. And I'd spent a fair amount of time at Max Planck Institute in Freiburg in Germany, and had a one-day-a-week professorship, bizarrely, in the Netherlands from the mid-1990s, and had reached a point in my career in America where I can remember soliloquizing with a good friend, saying, Michael, this is the friend, couldn't you help me find a job as a president of a small college or a foundation? Because I'm 45 now, and I've done X books, written X books, and edited Y books, and published Z articles. And if I look forward 20 years, and that's 3X, 3Y, and 10Z, that'll be a pretty boring life. I'd like to do something different. He wasn't able to help me find a college presidency or a foundation presidency, but in due course, this institute at Cambridge had a need for a new director. As I saw it, it was a place that had been floating for a long time, might benefit from a little energy, might benefit from a little more entrepreneurism than was typical of English academia. And when I applied, to my astonishment, they offered it to me. And I went there and met with the Vice Chancellor and actually negotiated a pretty demanding deal of things they had to provide if I was to accept the job, and they did. And so I went there, and as you know, since you were one of the first people I hired to come there after my effort to recruit the brightest young European academics who study crime, I was there for a while. We had some fun, and we got some things done.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I wanted to move on to getting an understanding of what you're currently doing. I mean, you've been working so many things with a focus on the criminal justice system and punishment, and I just wondered whether you could give me an update on your current main research interests. What are you currently working on?
Well, everything I've done, I think, starts with working with Norval Morris, who was an Australian who made his career in a variety of countries, but eventually in the US. And he was interested in prisons and punishment. And when I went to work with him, he said to me, you need to find a specialty, Michael. No one studies sentencing. No one studies the process by which judges decide what to do with the human beings who are under their power, who committed crimes. And probably almost everything that I've done since then relates to that narrow little human experience of one human being sitting there with a lot of power, but also a set of ethics and moral beliefs and norms and biases and prejudices, and a person standing in front of him or her who is the object of that power. And so I've worked in a lot of different fields. I've worked on race and crime issues because race and ethnicity are clearly important things that influence what happens when citizens are standing before judges. And I've done a lot of comparative work because different countries and different cultures have different institutions and ways of thinking about these things. I do a lot of work in philosophy because there are some deep normative issues that need to be sorted out about how the state and how individuals acting as judges or prosecutors in the name of the state may or ought to or may not deal with the lives of people. So everything is focused on that funny little almost cameo scene of here's a judge up on a bench and here's a person standing in the room in front of them. and something's got to happen. Trying to understand what that is, and later in my life trying to influence how that happened, how it worked.
Among all the things that you've done, can you give me one or two examples of a finding, something that you learned that really surprised you? I think most academics have this one or two things that they figure out, and it really sticks and they think about it.
Well, here's one. It's a little chain. So I started working on race issues. I did a book on race and crime in the early 90s, and it documented and traced developments over time in racial differences in the likelihood of being convicted of crimes or sent to prison. And at that time in America, the chances that a black person was in prison were about 6 times higher than those of whites. Mostly that was because of different patterns of involvement in crime, and partly was about bias and system processes and stereotyping. So I wondered, I wonder how much worse America is than other countries about this. So I did an article in which I collected data from Canada, Australia, England, and the US, and I discovered, lo and behold, racial disparities were least in the United States of any of those countries. America was 6-to-1 for black to white. England was 8-to-1 Afro-Caribbean to non-Afro-Caribbean. Canada was 12-to-1 Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, or first citizen to settlers. Australia was 16-to-1. And I thought, isn't that interesting? These things are terrible in the US. The dynamic is clearly very different in each one of these countries. The historical explanations of those patterns, but nonetheless, it's actually somewhat less worse, less awful. And then I took it another step, and I thought, I wonder if this is something about countries in which white people who either are British or are the descendants of British colonists have power over people who don't look like them. And so I did a similar project in Europe, which actually became my door into a lot more work in continental Europe. So we did it for 8 countries. And it turned out that in every country, there's at least one group of people who are 7 or 8 or 9 times more likely to be in prison than the majority population. The real surprise was that the US wasn't the worst of the lot. But a somewhat lesser but pretty big surprise is that what one might think of as ethnic disparities exist everywhere on at least as large a scale.
I would be tempted to ask you whether you can give me a tentative answer in one or maybe 2 sentences, why you think this is such a universal pattern.
I'm afraid I cannot do that, because most of the things I might say I could immediately disprove by giving you an example of another group. So, for example, and this is not 2 sentences, it is in immigration studies, which is another area that I've worked in a lot, it is very well known that Turks and Moroccans in the Netherlands are demographically, educationally, vocationally, and in terms of public health, identical in terms of group characteristics. That is, they are much less well educated, much less likely to be well employed, have shorter life expectancies than Dutch people. And so if you learn that Moroccans are much more likely than Dutch people to be arrested and sent to prison and to commit crimes, more often, at least according to the best evidence we have, you might say, oh, it's something about social exclusion or at least non-acculturation. But then you look to the Turks, who look identical on most of these measures. Their arrest rates and imprisonment rates are the same as the Dutch. So it's not a one-answer question. It's got something to do both with the culture and institutions in the receiving country, and something to do with cultural background and expectations that shape people of a culture in the place where they came from. So I'm sorry, I couldn't do 2 sentences.
That was...
Unless you want to put a lot of semicolons in that, that last paragraph.
That was... there would be lots of things to think about. Can I ask you, you've achieved so many things throughout your career. Are there achievements that you're particularly proud of?
Well, I'm sure these can be edited. So I'll say the first one is I found this beautiful Italian woman and moved to Italy. So I'm pretty proud of that, but that'll probably get edited out. So this Crime and Justice series. I mean, to me, it's pretty amazing that I'm as old as I am, and it's amazing that I've been doing something for 40 years, and yeah, and I've done that as a matter partly of self-indulgence, because the mission, the model of this book series has always been to commission people to write things. I used to do it with an editorial board, and we made lots. Now it's mostly me. But always, we've mostly commissioned papers on subjects I wanted to learn about. So I've had this remarkable luxury that I could, for example, ask young Eisner, could you write an article for us on the history of patterns of violence in Western Europe since the 12th century? Now, it's a subject I knew nothing about, except that I knew that it existed as a subject. And if young Eisner wrote the paper, and I sent it out to reviewers, and then read it very carefully, and then asked myself, what do I want to know that he didn't tell me? And then I write him a letter saying, Eisner, it's a wonderful paper, but could you answer the following 17 questions in the paper? And he does. It's been a continuous series, selfishly for me, of personal seminars on things I'm interested in. And without getting too vainglorious, it has not been poorly received in the intellectual communities to which it's addressed. So externally it seems to have been of some use, and personally it's been enormously, self-indulgently useful.
Yeah. I want to move on to talk a little bit about your perception of criminology.
Okay.
And you're one of these very few people, can't even think of anybody else who's probably almost equally at home in US criminology and European criminology. So I want to add something to your comparative, to benefit from your comparative skills. What do you think characterizes US criminology, and how is it different from European criminology? Or the other way around?
Okay, I remember these things change over time, so I'm going to give you a snapshot answer in 2016. If this had been 2000, it would have been a different snapshot, because both have changed. American criminology, you won't be surprised to hear this, but maybe in 20 years somebody else looking at this film, if anyone does, will, is vastly more quantitative than European criminology. It's theoretical, but in a narrow sense of theory, of ideological theory. What is our theoretical expectation of how people in this circumstance, influenced by those variables, will behave? And does our strong research design confirm that hypothesis or not? And if it does further research help us explain why our hypothesis was confirmed? American criminology is almost devoid of social theory. There is some qualitative work, but it's a tiny fraction of the total, and neither of those latter two areas receive much prestige. You'll find very few major qualitative or theoretical researchers in most American criminology departments. You'll find almost no historians, no philosophers. Increasingly it's sociological in its frame of reference, except for the developmental criminology world, which is psychological. European criminology, I think, has much more of a legal emphasis. It's much less quantitative, and it's much more openly concerned with values. Because if I talk to the major people who work in subjects I work in, understanding sentencing, understanding prosecution, understanding prisons and how they operate, people would explicitly say, my mission in life is to make the quality of life in prisons better. And so we are doing research based upon the normative premise that as a matter of human rights, we could treat human beings better. You would never find a major American prisons researcher formulating his or her mission in that way. So I think there's much more of a focus on policy in an immediate sense than there is in the US. And I think there's much more of a focus on norms and on human rights and on treating human beings well than there is in American criminology. So something almost a bit, maybe the American criminology is more scientific in some laboratory sense of science. It's much less humane, dealing with hugely difficult human problems, and of course the individual researchers empathize with the human beings they're studying with, of course they do. But their mission isn't, it isn't to change it, it's to understand, describe, and explain it.
When I go to the United States, or kind of like traveling between the two continents, I often wonder what the differences are in respect of the research policy relationship. And there are moments when for instance, last year, the round table on crime trends, where I have the impression that criminology has a higher reputation and higher prestige, maybe even more influence on policy making. But then on the other hand, I often sometimes also feel that in Europe, criminologists have better access to political decision making. So what's your perception about differences?
Well, here's one perception. I'm absolutely astonished by your observation that criminologists have higher status in the US and more influence. I think most American criminologists would say, wrongly, that they have no influence at all. They do have influence on lots of questions, but not the ones they care about. I would say that in general, American policy is much less influenced by science, work done by people who call them criminologists and other kinds of work, than European is. There are some few exceptions. American policymakers love police, and so police research has had real, direct, visible influence on practice in the US. Sentencing, prosecution, prisons, no influence whatever. Community penalties, no influence whatever. In Europe, in America, many academics would say, it's not our business to do policy, our business is to provide knowledge to policymakers. So our model is we develop knowledge and it influences policy. It relatively seldom does, except in certain areas. In Europe, where academics are much more open about, especially in my areas, about having a human rights agenda, I think actually they have vastly more influence. For example, there is nothing like experts committees in the United States, whereas the EU and the Council of Europe, and even many national governments, have expert groups who advise them and seem actually to have influence. I mean, you're from Switzerland, not Germany, but lots of German criminal code provisions come out of committee reports or recommendations of groups chaired by law professors and consisting of law professors and civil servants. There's no influence of that kind in the United States, whatever.
It's interesting what you're saying, because just to explain where my question was coming from, I think I was probably quite a lot influenced by my interest in prevention research, and I'm sure this is true, you know, the whole movement of evidence-based prevention, the development of the recognition at government level that having some evidence base behind prevention programs, now increasingly in the United States, for instance, the fact that funding schemes are linked to academic evidence that some prevention programs actually work. So I think this is probably an area where the United States have been leading and Europe has been slowly catching up with this link between research and policy making. But that may be just a very different policy making area
Well, I have two quick replies to that. The first is that I work with adults and you work with kids. Policy toward kids is much more humane in the US, especially outside the direct juvenile justice, criminal justice context than it is with adults. But the second is to remind you that I said American academics say they have no influence on policy at all. But that's not true, I quickly said. And my first example was policing research. But a second one would have been early childhood things. It's different government agencies that provide the funding. It's different government agencies that develop strategies for how to target social problems. The US is rich, and so government agencies have lots of money. So if you had said to me, Michael, tell me about early childhood interventions to reduce risk factors for unhappy life circumstances like crime and early pregnancy, early sexual behavior, and so on. I was, oh yes, that's an area probably in which US policymakers will spend money on and pay attention to science. But that's because they're thinking, here's an anecdote. I used to work on capital punishment defense work. There is an industry known as defense planning, where social workers basically, in a case in which somebody is charged with a crime for which they can be executed, put together a huge profile on a person, their life and their circumstances and so on, to be used to argue in mitigation against death. And there was a famous case, it would take too long to talk the facts, but a 14-year-old boy whose parents were a black boy whose parents were classical musicians who died in an airplane crash, and he was raised by a minister who sexually abused him chronically. He dropped out of school at age 23, he's one of a group who killed somebody. And now the defense planners present this to the governor of Louisiana. And the Louisiana governor says, no, I am not going to commute capital punishment. He says, I have enormous sympathy with that little boy. I think about his life and it can make me cry, he says. I have no sympathy with the adult who decided to commit a robbery in which somebody was killed. And so this ability in American political culture to separate parts of people's lives. The famous political scientist James Q. Wilson was like this. He was hugely invested in improving young people's life chances. And he was absolutely unmoved by arguments that it's deeply troubled people who've lived terrible lives, who the criminal courts and the police deal with. Yeah. So it's partly our specialties. So you work on the developmental things, so you see the smiling side of American political culture in relation to criminological type research. I work with adults, and I see the frowning side.
I'm not sure whether we can talk about this some other time in more detail. I'm not sure it's a complete contradiction, because it seems to me that this evidence-based prevention movement shares this interest in academic rigor and quantification and randomized controlled trials. While also in the prevention area across Europe, there is probably, whether rightly or wrongly, a stronger belief in this is the right thing to do. And we don't necessarily need science, we think this is the right thing to do. Right. So I think there may be some similarity, at least at this level. I wanted to move on to the European Society of Criminology, which when I came to Cambridge, I still remember the first meeting in The Hague where we founded the society. And I just wondered whether you could tell me something about what your perception of the process towards the foundation of the society was.
Well, subject to imperfect memory, I probably could give a long speech on that. In Toronto, at the American Society of Criminology meeting in November 1999, someone observed that there were 500 Europeans among the 1,600 people attending. If you ask people why so many Europeans went to the American Society of Criminology, one often received the answer, oh, it's an efficient way to see other European researchers. It's the only place where really active people congregate. We held a small planning meeting there of about 10 people, Ernesto Savona of Italy, Martin Kilias of Switzerland, 2 or 3 Dutch people, including Henk van de Bont, who then headed the VODC, and Josien Jungertas. I was there, and I could name a few others, but there were about 8 or 10 of us, and we decided to try to do something. And Henk van de Bont offered to use money from the Dutch Ministry of Justice to convene a meeting in The Hague to discuss the founding of an organization. We did. There were big fights. It was actually a schism. French participants absolutely did not want to see a European Society of Criminology because their belief was that it would be quantitative, based on American styles, and Anglophonic. I was the only American in the room, so it wasn't because there was a large American delegation to whom they were reacting. And even some German researchers were so supportive of the French that they refused, some of them for a decade, to attend ESC meetings because they were signs of positivist administrative criminology taking over Europe. But nonetheless, it was established. Early meetings, you were probably part of the first one that Kilias organized in Lausanne. I think it's grown extraordinarily well. I mean, the numbers, in some ways, are a great accomplishment. To have 1,500 people in Porto and 1,200 here in Munster is remarkable from a little group of 115 years ago. That's good. It's bad in some ways. It's less intimate. It's less cohesive. It's more anonymous because it gets bigger. But in a way, that's a sign probably of its scientific maturation, that it's becoming a self-sustaining organization that no longer has a discernible, narrow culture, but plays an important role institutionally in many things that happen. So I'm sort of amazed that it's come this far. Little known is that it remains officially located in Cambridge. You may not know this.
No, I wasn't aware of that.
When we organized it, Martin Kilias did most of the organizing work. And we searched around to find in Europe what was the country that had the most congenial charitable organizations law. Congenial in the sense of requiring almost nothing. English law required almost nothing. You could found the organization in England. There was no obligation to provide annual reports. There was no obligation to provide financial reports. So technically, the ESC remains an English nonprofit. I'm sure the organizing books were long since lost, 2 or 3 directors ago, but it is technically still an English organization.
What would you see as the main... So you've seen all these conferences, this last 16 conferences, and you probably attended, I don't know whether...
I'm afraid all of them, yeah.
All of them. So, is there, looking back at these 16 conferences, is there some thematic changes, something that kind of like you would describe as the main lines of development over this period?
Oh, right. So I went to the first British, it was called the British Criminology Conference in the late 70s, with 100 people. Now it's every year and it's 700. And I went to ASC meetings, Americans, in the 80s, which were attended by 500 people. And in all those cases, those early years were cozy. Everybody didn't know everybody, but everybody almost knew of somebody, or most you were 2 points removed from other people. And so there was a social quality to them that has long since disappeared, at least from the American and the European. So I have 2 answers. One is this is becoming much more bureaucratic, much bigger. On the other hand, if you contrast it with the American Society of Criminology, it still says some huge things to be said in its favor. For example, if you were to wander through these buildings while panels are in session, you will see a handful of people in private conversations and wandering around not knowing what to do. If you're at the American Society of Criminology and you go during a panel session you will see hundreds and hundreds of people in the hotel lobby and in the books exhibits, and people go to the ASC to a large extent not to attend panels and not to learn things, but to socialize and achieve other kinds of functions. At the ASC, there's still much more of a sense of seriousness. When I was president at the ESC, when I was president of the ASC, we did a little survey and we learned that 27% of scheduled speakers did not appear. That's because they had to have a scheduled talk to get funding from their universities to attend, and most of these weren't really researchers, so they had nothing to say. So if they registered to give a talk, that qualified their funds, and then they would be too embarrassed to give a talk that they knew nothing about. Whereas at the ESC, that I think is probably a really rare phenomenon. People cancel. Probably a few people irresponsibly just don't appear when they should. But I think there's much more of a seriousness of purpose. The other difference is, though, that there clearly is much more of a shift toward quantitative American-style research being discussed at the ESC than there was 10 years ago, and certainly than there was 15 years ago.
I'm curious about you mentioned the problem with, or the schism with France, and I wonder where your current assessment is of the integrative potential of the European Society of Criminology. Is there still cultures, language areas where you would like to see more participation, more integration?
Well, I mean, the French absence remains conspicuous, despite having had a French president. Now that has something to do with the status and nature of criminology in France, whereas one famous French criminologist named René Lévy once told me, well, the people who call them criminologists, by the standards of any country except France, are not. They are criminal lawyers. And the people who do what criminologists do in other countries have other names. They're called political scientists or sociologists. But that wouldn't explain why we don't have, we have 100 and something Germans here. And we have 90 Belgians, of whom a third are French-speaking. And we probably have 10 French people. And the other group would probably be the Warsaw Pact countries of northeastern Europe. We're doing reasonably well at getting, not huge numbers, but Hungarians and Czechs and Poles and people from the Balkans are coming, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, not so many, but enough regularly. Almost no one from Russia. I've never seen anyone here from Belarus, if anybody has ever come. They may have, but Ukraine. That's probably as much about the development of universities and scientific cultures and so on in those countries as anything else. But so I said we've failed somehow to integrate French-speaking French people. But I don't think it's the ESC's failure. I think it's probably the deliberate. No, it's not even a collective decision. Lots of individuals thinking, what's in it for me to go there to hear all these talks in English about kinds of research I'm not much interested in? And so they don't.
So what's on your wish list for the future in terms of European criminology? If you could.
Oh wow.
So then, we can then look at the video in 10 years' time. And
So I hope the creeping Americanization of European criminology doesn't, not that it stops, but that it doesn't become predominant. We've already got North American criminology. I'm not sure we need another continent of as many people doing the same kinds of things in the same kinds of ways. So I hope that there's a bridgehead, and that's fine, that people are interested in those kinds of issues. But I hope European criminology retains more of a humane, more of a theoretical, more of a policy emphasis than American criminology does now. I think I've run out of things to say about that. I'm sorry to say.
I was just thinking of a linked question, but at a slightly different level. Coming back to our prior conversation about policy impact of criminologists. I think it's true to say that criminologists are often motivated by doing something good about the criminal justice system, but also about reducing crime and so on. Currently, Europe is trying to deal with the migration crisis and with a huge number of issues related to extremism, to maintaining the law, the rule of law when it comes to migrants, figuring out how to deal with migrants. Do you think that criminology is pulling its weight in terms of contributing to this area of policy making and of an important social problem in Europe?
You're asking me questions about subject specialty areas that I'm not especially familiar with, so I can't give a very informed answer. I have always wondered why, when terrorism became a much more visible issue in the US, and international human rights problems, crimes against humanity, genocide, became something that more human rights people worried about, why so many criminologists flocked into those fields. In a way, it seemed trendy to me and seemed to be moving away from what people had a depth of experience and knowledge and intellectual history to address. I have a little bit of the same feeling about terrorism. Now, clearly governments, the Max Planck Institute in Freiburg has done a lot of work on trying to understand better and propose improvements in positive law in relation to terrorism and prevention of terrorism. And those are important things to do. And there are kinds of work that people who call themselves criminologists do that might well be germane to thinking through problems and solutions. And that seems to be right. But why people who call it criminologists become specialists in the prevention of terrorism, I don't quite understand. It seems to me there are probably other disciplinary areas. Public health might be one. I could probably think of some areas in psychology that seem much more naturally fitted to it. My cynical explanation for why in the United States there are now a lot of criminologists who study terrorism is that that's where the money was.
Yeah.
You know, a famous bank robber once was asked, Willie Sutton, why do you commit bank robberies? And his answer was, that's where the money is. So I think criminologists can probably be helpful. I can't see criminologists having really any unique, distinctive contribution to make. It's huge social problems and lots of disciplines, some of them more naturally developed to address those kinds of questions, have to address them. And if criminologists want to, more power to them, but I don't see that we have any really special strengths to bring to that.
I want to just probe you on your area of specialization, namely on sentencing. And Europe has, if I see this right, by and large avoided the punitive turn that the United States has taken, with the UK probably going farthest in a similar direction. And so I wonder whether you can say something from a perspective as a criminologist. What do you think the main reform challenges of the criminal justice system over the next 10 or 20 years might be? Or let me put it this, maybe that's a better question. If you were to give advice to a young, upcoming, talented scholar who's interested in criminal justice, and you mentioned that Morris told you, well, go into sentencing, nobody's doing this. What would you say to the young scholar? What are the topics that are really interesting, that have been unexplored, that we should do in Europe?
That you should do in Europe? I think you almost have me stymied. I do a lot of comparative work. there are a lot of things that most European countries, not all, certainly continental countries, do much better than Americans do. Europeans, by and large, have removed not only the day-to-day operations of the justice system from influence by politics and the media and passing public attitudes, but they've also, by and large, removed the law-making process from influence by those things. So when you said that law and order and harsh policies, the punitive turn is the phrase you used, doesn't seem to have had as powerful influence here as it did in the US. That's clearly right. Differs between countries a bit. It's not entirely right. Almost every country actually has become negative side, much harsher, somewhat harsher in dealing with violence and sex offenses. Positive side, rather than accepting that it was inexorable, therefore that there would be more people in prison, what most European countries did in response to that development, and more generally in response to rising crime rates in the 70s and 80s, was decide that more prison wasn't really a very good idea. and how else can we handle these increased numbers of people? So I think in general Europeans have done it much better. What would young people study? It's going to vary somewhat on the country. In some countries, there are such strong norms about what's just and such clear answers to the question, how do we know? In Scandinavia, we know what's just by looking what people who get the same crime get in a different court. And we look at what people who did a slightly more serious crime get in the same court in different courts. That's pretty powerful if your prison sentences are 3 months and 6 months and 9 months. So the problem there of human equity, of the Rechtsstaat treating all citizens equally under this particular circumstances, is pretty well solved. In England, it's not. If you look at the almost non-existent research on sentencing in England and Wales, there are enormous disparities. The numbers aren't American numbers. It isn't 0 to 20 years for a particular crime under particular circumstances, but it's 0 to 7 years, or it's 2 years to 10 years. And so I suppose what I would, no, so I'm talking at such great length that it helps me figure out an answer to your question. What Europeans need in countries in which that's a problem, just treatment of the people standing in front of the judge, is a big investment in real and quantitative, rigorous research on what happens to human beings as they are processed through that system. In England, the reason that doesn't happen is that the judges won't let it happen. And governments have let judges refuse to learn what they're actually doing, and take solace in the judicial belief that, oh, there are no disparities. Any judge can explain to me why he or she did what she did, as if that non sequitur explained different outcomes in cases. What was a different judge is the real answer, and that's not a good answer.
I would like to end this interview with a question on your perception of whether of gender issues in the Society of Criminology. Do you think that, I don't even remember what the current situation is. Do you think there more should be done to promote, help women become criminologists, have academic careers in criminology? Do you think the gender issue as a subject in criminology is taken seriously enough?
Well, you would get different answers from different people, and they would probably be somewhat systematic, different for male and female answerers to that question. In an empirical sense, I'm pretty confident that more than half the people here are women. In most graduate criminology programs, I think this is probably true in Cambridge as well, a clear majority of the students are women. In those crude terms, you say, well, women seem to be participating actively and fully. There haven't been, half of the presidents of the ESC have not been women. On the other hand, if you qualify that by looking at the age cohorts from which presidents are drawn, if you want to count the number of senior women academics over 55 who have PhDs and worked in criminology, it probably is 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 30 of senior people. But if you look at 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, it's probably 70% of people finishing PhDs are women. So I think probably the ESC has not done too badly. Whether if I were a woman and was sensitive to different vibrations, I would feel that, notwithstanding what Tonry just said about numbers, women are treated differently, they aren't taken as seriously. I don't know. I just don't know. From where I stand, it looks like women are pretty active, pretty equal participants in things, and that there's not a huge problem. My wife may kick me when I get home.
Right.
For saying that.
Well, I very much hope this isn't going to happen. We are towards the end of the interview, but I think I just wanted to give you an opportunity before we conclude to raise an issue, whatever you thought you wanted to talk about, and I haven't asked you about. Whether there was anything that you wanted to say.
Oh my goodness.
You don't have to.
I'd like to see you young people charging ahead, finding new fields and conquering them. I think it would be nice, excuse me, I think criminology in most countries is sadly intellectually insular. In the US especially, if you look at modern American criminology departments, almost everybody there has been trained either in a sociology department or a criminology, criminal justice department with a strong sociology intellectual orientation. I cannot think of a single major historian located in an American criminal justice department. There may be some, you may know some because you're an historian. I can think of only one major philosopher based in a criminal justice or criminology program. Europe is somewhat better about that, I think, although I don't know, I don't have enough breadth of knowledge and data to say that. But this is really a humane study, right? This is complicated, absolutely elemental human behavior and normative efforts to understand how human beings do and ought to interact with each other. Because the ways we think about things change so rapidly over 30 years. I mean, 40 years ago in the United States, nobody would have dreamt of the idea of executing kids, or sending kids to life without the possibility of parole, or prosecuting all 16-year-olds, as happens in New York, in adult courts. It would have been in nobody's mind. These are kids, they're different, they're intellectually and emotionally underdeveloped. Why would you do that? And that radically changed. By the 1980s, American policymakers were saying, do the crime, do the time. Do an adult crime, do adult time. And that's a huge difference. Historians pay attention to things like that. Sociologists tend not to. And so when you walk into a problem in 2016, you say, wow, it really looks like that, doesn't it? And you don't realize that 20 years ago it looked like something completely different. A huge amount is lost. And I think the same thing would be true about philosophy. I think the same thing is probably true about public health. Right? There's a huge public health relevance to understanding the problems that criminals. So I guess my longer term mission, were I to have a long-term mission, if I were still running an institute or something, would to try to make it even more interdisciplinary, but in a rich, connected way. Not silos of here's our psychiatrist and here's our philosopher and here's our historian.
So thank you very much for this
My pleasure.
fantastic, informative interview.
Great. Thank you.